The year is 1526. The battlefield of Mohacs lies silent, carpeted with the bodies of 20,000 Hungarian warriors. Among the dead is King Louis II himself, drowned in a muddy stream while fleeing in heavy armor. But for the women waiting in villages and castles across Hungary, the real horror is just beginning. When Ottoman soldiers march through their gates, these women know their fate will be worse than their husbands' quick deaths on the battlefield. They will vanish into a world from which few ever return, a world where their names, their faith, and their very identities will be stripped away forever. This is not just another tale of conquest. This is the story of millions of forgotten women whose lives were shattered by the Ottoman Empire's most cruel practice. What happened to them reveals a systematic horror that lasted for over 600 years. The Ottoman Empire conquered vast territories from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Arabian Peninsula. With each victory came a dark ritual that terrified populations across 3 continents. When Ottoman forces defeated an army, they didn't just claim the land, they claimed the women. Picture a small Serbian village in 1459. The men have marched off to defend their homeland against Sultan Mehmed II's advancing army. The women gather in the church, praying for their husband's safe return. Then comes the news that breaks their world apart. The Serbian army has been crushed. The Ottomans are coming. What follows next has been recorded in countless historical documents, though many prefer to forget. Ottoman soldiers arrive at dawn. They break down doors. They drag women from their homes. Mothers are torn from their children. Daughters are pulled from their father's arms. Sisters are separated forever. These women face 3 possible fates, and each one destroys the life they knew. The young and beautiful are selected for the Sultan's harem or given to Ottoman officers as rewards. The ordinary become household slaves. The elderly and unwanted are often killed or left to starve. But the selection process itself is a form of torture. Women are lined up like cattle at market. Ottoman officers inspect them, checking their teeth, their hair, their bodies. They're sorted by age, beauty, and perceived value. Imagine standing there, knowing your entire future depends on the whim of men who see you as property, not human. The journey to Ottoman territories becomes a death march for many. Chained together, these women walk hundreds of miles, no proper food, no warm clothing, no medical care. Historical records from the Siege of Constantinople in 1453 describe columns of Byzantine women stretching for miles, stumbling through Anatolia towards slave markets in Damascus and Cairo. Those who collapse from exhaustion are left to die by the roadside. Pregnant women who give birth during the march often watch their newborns taken away or killed. One Venetian merchant traveling through Ottoman lands in 1479 wrote about encountering such a column. He described women so broken by grief and exhaustion that they no longer resembled living beings. The slave markets of Istanbul, Damascus, and Cairo operated like machines of human misery. Women stood on platforms while buyers examined them. Prices varied based on age, beauty, and skills. A young, educated European woman might fetch a fortune. An older peasant woman might sell for the price of a good horse. The historian Leslie Pierce documented that in the 1500s, the Istanbul slave market alone processed thousands of women each year. These weren't just numbers. Each one was someone's wife, mother, daughter, or sister. Each had a name, a story, a life that was erased the moment they stepped onto that platform. Buyers had specific preferences that determined these women's fates. Ottoman nobles sought educated European women who could teach their children languages and arts. Wealthy merchants wanted strong women for household labor. Military officers chose young women as concubines. The choices made in those markets condemned women to vastly different but equally tragic fates. For women selected for harems, life became a golden prison. The word harem simply means forbidden or sacred, but for captured women, it meant complete isolation from the outside world. Once inside those walls, they would never leave except in a coffin. The imperial harem in Topkapi Palace held hundreds of women at its height. but only a tiny fraction ever saw the Sultan. Most lived their entire lives as servants to other servants, existing in a strict hierarchy where captured foreign women occupied the lowest ranks. They woke before dawn to serve others, ate leftover food, and slept on cold stone floors. Even those who caught the Sultan's eye faced a precarious existence. They might bear his children, but could never marry him. They could be discarded at any moment, sent away to live in poverty, or given as gifts to other men. The Ottoman Prince Ibrahim once gave away 40 of his concubines in a single day, simply because he was bored with them. The psychological torture of harem life broke many women. Cut off from their families, forbidden to practice their religion, forced to adopt new names and identities, they lost themselves piece by piece. Some went mad from isolation. Others took their own lives rather than endure another day. One of the most heartbreaking accounts comes from a Venetian woman captured in 1571. Sold to a pasha's harem, she managed to smuggle out a letter to her family. She wrote that she had forgotten the sound of her mother's voice and could no longer remember her real name. She begged them to pray for her death. Women who became household slaves faced different but equally devastating hardships. They worked from before sunrise until after midnight, cooking, cleaning, washing, serving. Any mistake brought harsh punishment. Beatings were common. Food deprivation was standard. Some were branded like animals to prevent escape. These women had no rights whatsoever. Their owners could do anything to them without consequence. Sexual assault was routine. If a slave woman became pregnant by her master, the child would also be a slave. Generation after generation, born into bondage, never knowing freedom. The Ottoman legal system offered no protection. Under Islamic law, as interpreted by the Ottomans, these women were property, not people. Killing a slave brought only a minor fine. Raping a slave wasn't even considered a crime. The woman herself could be punished for tempting her attacker. Many tried to escape, but the consequences were severe. Captured runaways faced mutilation. Some had their ears or noses cut off. Others were branded on the face. The lucky ones were simply beaten and returned to slavery. The unlucky ones were executed as examples to others. The tragedy extends beyond individual suffering. Entire bloodlines were erased. Noble families that had ruled for centuries saw their daughters disappear into Ottoman households. The wives of legendary warriors became nameless servants. Princesses became kitchen slaves. Consider the fate of the Byzantine nobility after Constantinople fell in 1453. Women who had lived in palaces, who had worn silk and jewels, who had commanded servants, suddenly found themselves scrubbing floors in Ottoman households. The Duchess Anna Notaras, whose father was the last Grand Duke of Byzantium, was given as a gift to a Turkish soldier. She went from one of the most powerful women in the Christian world to a nobody overnight. The Ottomans developed an entire bureaucracy around this system. They kept detailed records of captured women, treating them like inventory. Age, origin, price paid, owner's name. Reading these ledgers today is chilling. Human beings reduced to entries in account books. The Devshirme system, though primarily focused on boys, also affected women indirectly but devastatingly. When Ottoman officials took Christian boys to become janissaries, they often took girls too. These girls vanished into Ottoman households as servants or concubines. Parents who lost sons to the Devshirme knew they might see them again as soldiers. Parents who lost daughters knew they were gone forever. Village records from the Balkans show the terror this system created. When Ottoman officials approached, families would mutilate their children to make them undesirable. Some girls had their faces scarred. Others had fingers cut off. Parents chose to maim their daughters rather than lose them to Ottoman slavery. The cultural destruction was systematic and intentional. The Ottomans understood that capturing women meant destroying the enemy's future. Without wives and mothers, communities couldn't rebuild. Without daughters, families ended. It was demographic warfare, designed to break conquered populations permanently. This strategy worked devastatingly well in some regions. Parts of Anatolia that were Greek and Armenian for thousands of years became Turkish within generations. The Balkans saw entire ethnic groups disappear, not through battlefield deaths, but through the systematic removal of women. Some women found ways to resist, though their stories are rarely told. In 1570, a group of captured Cypriot women chose mass suicide rather than slavery, throwing themselves from cliffs as Ottoman soldiers watched. In 1686, Polish women trapped in a besieged fortress killed their own children and themselves, rather than let them fall into Ottoman hands. Others resisted more quietly. They secretly taught their children about their true heritage. They whispered prayers in forbidden languages. They preserved recipes, songs, and stories from their homeland. These small acts of defiance kept cultures alive, even in the darkest circumstances. The convert or die ultimatum given to many captured women created its own form of torture. Converting to Islam meant betraying everything they believed. Refusing meant death or worse treatment. Most converted, at least outwardly, but lived with the guilt for the rest of their lives. The forced conversions had profound psychological effects. Women described feeling split in two, maintaining a Muslim exterior while clinging to Christian beliefs internally. This double life created constant fear and anxiety. Discovery meant death, but maintaining the deception meant living a lie every moment. Some women managed to gain power within the Ottoman system, but at tremendous personal cost. Roxolana, a captured Ukrainian woman, became the Sultan's wife and one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. But she achieved this by forgetting her past, embracing her captors, and becoming complicit in the same system that had destroyed her own life. These powerful women, known as valide sultans, when they were mothers of reigning sultans, wielded enormous influence. But they used that influence to perpetuate the same system of slavery that had captured them. They ordered raids to capture more women. They maintained harems filled with slaves. They had become what they once feared. The economic impact of this system was staggering. The Ottoman Empire's economy depended heavily on slave labor, particularly female slaves who performed essential household work. Historians estimate that at its peak, slaves made up 20% of Istanbul's population. Most were women. This created a vicious cycle. The empire needed constant warfare to capture more slaves. More slaves enabled more warfare. The suffering of captured women literally fueled Ottoman expansion. Every conquered territory meant thousands more women condemned to slavery. The pregnancy and children of enslaved women created complex legal and social situations. Children born to slave mothers and free fathers occupied a strange middle ground. They weren't quite slaves, but weren't quite free either. These children often faced discrimination and limited opportunities throughout their lives. If a slave woman bore her master's child, she gained the title Walad, or mother of a child. This provided some protection. She couldn't be sold and would be freed upon her master's death, but this freedom came at a price. She remained property during her master's lifetime and could still face abuse and exploitation. The trauma passed through generations. Children born in slavery grew up watching their mothers serve and suffer. Daughters knew they would likely face the same fate. Sons might gain freedom but carried the shame of their origins. Entire family lines bore the scars of this system for centuries. Even freed slaves faced tremendous challenges. Freedom didn't mean equality. Former slaves were marked by their past, excluded from many occupations, and subjected to social discrimination. Women freed from harems often had no skills except servitude and no connections except former fellow slaves. Many freed women ended up in poverty or prostitution. After decades in captivity, they had no family to return to, no property, no means of support. The Ottoman system discarded them like worn-out tools, leaving them to survive however they could. The few women who managed to escape and return home faced a different kind of tragedy. Their families often rejected them, viewing them as dishonored or contaminated. Communities that should have welcomed them back instead shunned them. They had survived slavery, only to face exile from their own people. The Orthodox Church's stance made things worse. Women who had converted to Islam, even under force, were often considered apostates. Some churches refused to accept them back. Others demanded lengthy penance and public humiliation. The very institution that should have offered comfort instead added to their suffering. By the 1800s, European pressure began forcing changes to the Ottoman slave system, but these changes came slowly and often existed only on paper. Slavery wasn't officially abolished in the Ottoman Empire until 1908, and even then, the practice continued in various forms. The last Ottoman harems operated well into the 20th century. When the empire fell in 1922, thousands of women who had spent their entire lives in captivity were suddenly freed. Most had nowhere to go. They had been captured as children, and now, as elderly women, found themselves in a world they didn't recognize. The legacy of this system extends far beyond its official end. Across the former Ottoman Empire, millions of people today descend from captured women. Their family histories include gaps that can never be filled, names that were erased, stories that were silenced. In the Balkans, Turkey, and the Middle East, this history remains sensitive and often unspoken. Families know they have ancestors who were slaves, but rarely discuss it. The shame and trauma, even generations later, keep these stories buried. Modern DNA studies have revealed the massive genetic impact of Ottoman slavery. Populations across the former empire show genetic markers indicating widespread mixing between Ottoman men and captured foreign women. Each marker represents a woman taken from her home, a family destroyed, a life stolen. The psychological concept of intergenerational trauma helps us understand how this historical horror continues affecting people today. Trauma doesn't end with the person who experienced it. It passes down through families in the form of behaviors, fears, and coping mechanisms that persist long after the original cause is forgotten. Women captured by the Ottomans didn't just lose their freedom. They lost their identities, their families, their futures, and often their will to live. The Ottoman system didn't just enslave their bodies, it attempted to erase their very existence. The numbers are staggering, but remember that each number was a person. Historians estimate that millions of women were enslaved during the Ottoman Empire's existence. Millions of mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives. Millions of dreams destroyed, lives shattered, futures stolen. We must remember these women not as statistics, but as individuals who suffered unimaginable horrors. They deserve to have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged, their memories preserved. For too long, they have been footnotes in history books, their anguish overshadowed by tales of battles and sultans. The Ottoman Empire's treatment of captured women represents one of history's longest and most systematic campaigns of human cruelty. For over 6 centuries, this practice destroyed countless lives and entire cultures. It weaponized sexual violence, used human beings as currency, and treated women as less than human. Yet even in the darkest moments, these women showed incredible strength. They maintained their humanity despite inhuman treatment. They preserved fragments of their cultures despite efforts to erase them. They loved their children despite the circumstances of their birth. They survived when survival itself was an act of rebellion. Their stories remind us that conquest is never just about territory or power. It's about human beings whose lives are destroyed by others' ambitions. Every war creates countless victims whose suffering continues long after the battle's end. Today, as conflicts continue around the world, we see echoes of these historical horrors. Women remain vulnerable in warfare, still targeted for sexual violence and enslavement. The Ottoman Empire may be gone, but the use of rape and slavery as weapons of war continues. Understanding this history isn't about demonizing any modern nation or people. The Ottoman Empire fell over a century ago, but understanding what happened helps us recognize and prevent similar atrocities today. It reminds us that civilization is fragile and human rights must be constantly defended. These forgotten women deserve more than our pity. They deserve our remembrance, our respect, and our commitment to ensuring such systematic cruelty never happens again. Their suffering wasn't inevitable or justified by the standards of their time. It was a choice made by those in power, a choice to treat human beings as property. As you go about your day, remember that freedom isn't guaranteed. Remember that throughout history, millions of women lived and died in bondage, their stories untold, their names forgotten. Remember that what happened to them could happen again if we forget the lessons of the past. Share this story with others. Talk about it. Don't let these women disappear into historical obscurity. They suffered in silence for centuries. The least we can do is ensure their stories are finally heard. Subscribe if you want to learn more forgotten histories that shaped our world. The past may be painful, but ignoring it ensures we remain vulnerable to repeating its horrors. Every view, every share, every discussion helps keep these memories alive and honors the millions of women whose voices were silenced. They cannot speak for themselves, but we can speak for them. We can ensure that what the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors is never forgotten and never repeated.